There is something important to clarify before we begin. This talk was not created to judge people who have experienced divorce, and it was not created to criticize those who have never gone through it. The purpose of this lecture is much simpler and much deeper. It is to quietly explore one question. Why do people give completely different answers to the same question about relationships? We often assume the difference comes from personality. Sometimes we say it is a difference in values, and sometimes we simply say people just think differently. But in reality, the difference is rarely about opinions. More often, it is about how far someone has traveled through life. Two people may stand in the same room, hear the same question, and yet speak entirely different languages when they answer. One person speaks in the language of hope. Another speaks in the language of conditions, structure, and consequences. From the outside, it may look like disagreement, but what we are really seeing is something else, a difference in lived experience. Experience changes the way we see reality. There's an ancient text in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In this text, there is a concept called bardo. Bardo refers to an intermediate state, a transition between two worlds. It is the state between death and rebirth. But what makes bardo fascinating is this: it cannot truly be understood by reading about it. It can only be understood by passing through it. People who have never experienced it may learn the concept. They may memorize the philosophy. But those who have crossed it speak about it in an entirely different way, because they are no longer describing an idea. They are describing a reality they have lived inside. Relationships also have their own bardo. In many ways, deep relationships have their own version of bardo. The formation of a relationship, the building of a shared life, and sometimes the collapse of that life. These are not just emotional experiences. They are transitions between worlds. Marriage, long-term partnership, separation, divorce. These moments change the structure of how a person understands connection, responsibility, and identity. Once someone has crossed that boundary, the language they use about relationships begins to change. They may become less romantic, but they often become more precise. They speak less about dreams and more about patterns, less about feelings and more about structures. And this is not because they have become cynical. It is because they have passed through a psychological transition that many others have not yet experienced. This lecture is not about who is right. The goal of this lecture is not to teach who is right and who is wrong. Instead, it invites us to develop a different skill, the ability to recognize where someone stands within their experience of relationships. Every person is standing somewhere along that path. Some people are still in the early stage of relationships, where connection feels full of possibility and discovery. Others have moved deeper into the complexity of shared life, where habits, responsibilities, and personal differences begin to reveal themselves. And some people have crossed the painful threshold, where a relationship collapses and identity must be rebuilt. Each stage produces its own language. Each stage produces its own way of understanding reality. A simple question that reveals a lot. In this series, Divorce Experience, Part 6, we will explore a very simple question. A question that might be asked to someone who may soon become part of a family. The question is this: what happens when two people live together for a long time, even though they were not originally family? At first glance, this seems like an ordinary question about daily life. But surprisingly, the answer to this question often reveals something profound. It can show whether a person still understands relationships, primarily through hope and imagination, or whether they have already encountered the structures and responsibilities that sustain or sometimes break long-term relationships. What makes this fascinating is that people rarely realize what they are revealing when they answer, but inside their response, one can often see very clearly how far they have actually lived inside the reality of relationships. Relationships are not just emotional stories. In modern culture, relationships are often described as emotional narratives. We talk about love, chemistry, compatibility, and happiness. And of course, those things matter. But anyone who has lived long enough inside a shared life eventually discovers something else. Relationships are not sustained by emotions alone. They are also systems. Systems of habits, systems of responsibilities, systems of expectations. Daily life slowly reveals differences in sleeping patterns, financial priorities, communication styles, emotional regulation, and family values. At first, these differences may seem small, but over time they accumulate, and eventually they begin to shape the entire architecture of the relationship. This is the moment when relationships shift from romantic imagination to structural reality, when experience changes the language. People who have gone through divorce often speak about relationships differently, not necessarily with bitterness, but with a kind of clarity that comes from lived experience. Instead of saying, "We will understand each other better," they may say, "You start to feel the differences in daily life." Instead of saying, "Love will solve the problems," they may say, "If people stop taking care of each other, conflicts inevitably grow." And instead of focusing only on the other person, they often say something surprising. You begin to see parts of yourself you didn't know were there. Avoidant, anger, control, immature emotional reactions. These are things that only become visible when two lives are deeply intertwined. In that sense, relationships become a mirror, and sometimes the most difficult discoveries are not about the other person, but about ourselves. The quiet lesson behind experience. In the philosophy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the images encountered in the Bardo are said to be projections of one's own mind. In other words, what appears terrifying or overwhelming is often something that was already present within us. Relationships can function in a very similar way. When a relationship reaches a breaking point, it is easy to believe that everything went wrong because of the other person. But with time and reflection, many people begin to see a more complex truth. They begin to ask, who was I in that relationship? What patterns did I bring into it? What responsibilities did I avoid? This shift from blaming others to examining oneself is often one of the most profound transformations that follows deep relational experience. Why this conversation matters. So again, this lecture is not about judging divorce, and it is not about deciding which perspective is correct. It is about understanding how experience changes perception. Some people speak about relationships from the world of possibility. Others speak from the world of structure, and neither voice should be dismissed. They simply come from different stages of lived experience. In the next part of this discussion, we will examine how responses to a single question can reveal these differences surprisingly clearly, because sometimes in just a few sentences, a person's understanding of relationships, their hopes, their assumptions, and their experience becomes visible in ways they may not even realize. If you find these philosophical explorations of relationships and human psychology meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing the lecture with others. Your support allows these conversations to continue. Now, let us move into the main discussion. In the previous section, we explored a simple idea that people do not speak about relationships differently because they think differently. They speak differently because they have lived through different depths of experience. Some speak from imagination. Others speak from the structure of lived reality. And once you begin to listen carefully, you notice something interesting. People who have never experienced divorce often imagine relationship problems in relatively simple terms. They imagine arguments. They imagine personality differences, maybe occasional misunderstandings. But in reality, long-term relationships rarely break because of a single argument. The real forces are often far more structural. They involve daily life, finances, responsibilities, family roles, and social expectations, all woven together in ways that are difficult to see from the outside. In the language of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, one might say that people who have not yet experienced these transitions are still looking at the early appearance of the illusion, not yet aware of how powerful it can become once it fully unfolds. They can see the doorway, but they do not yet know how deep the passage goes. What does being ready really mean? Consider another question that is sometimes asked when discussing relationships through examples. Have you ever seen a couple move too quickly in a relationship, skipping the stage of verification and preparation, letting emotions run ahead of reflection? When people who have never experienced divorce respond to this question, they often say something like, maybe they simply weren't ready. At first glance, this sounds like a thoughtful answer, but there is an important question hidden inside it. What does ready actually mean? For many people who have never experienced marriage or divorce, readiness is interpreted mainly as a psychological condition. Being ready means having determination, emotional maturity, commitment, a strong mindset. In other words, readiness is understood primarily as a state of mind, but for people who have already lived through marriage and divorce, the meaning of readiness often changes dramatically. Readiness is no longer just emotional. It becomes structural. It includes financial stability, clear division of responsibilities, the ability to navigate crises together, and the capacity to carry long-term obligations. In the philosophy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, being unprepared does not mean that the mind is weak. It means something more serious. It means one does not yet possess the capacity to endure the next world that awaits. The language of vague anxiety. Sometimes people who have not experienced divorce answer the same question differently. They may say, if the relationship moves too fast, it might make people feel uneasy. This is an honest answer, but the anxiety they describe is still relatively abstract. It is the feeling that something might go wrong, not yet the knowledge of what could actually be lost. People who have never gone through the collapse of a deep relationship often sense risk in a vague way, but they have not yet encountered the full consequences. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, anxiety is described as an important signal. It appears when awareness begins to blur. It is a warning that perception is losing clarity. But in the early stages, the individual can feel the anxiety without yet understanding what it is pointing toward. They sense the signal, but cannot fully interpret its meaning. Two different languages of relationships. If we step back for a moment, we can see a clear pattern. People who have never experienced divorce often describe relationships in the language of emotion and perception. They say, it's unfortunate. It feels uneasy. It's disappointing. These are emotional interpretations. But from the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, relationships are not simply emotional experiences. They are transitions between worlds. They represent movements between stages of identity, responsibility, and life structure, which means that sometimes a relationship is not merely changing, it is crossing a threshold that cannot easily be reversed. In that sense, the words used by people without divorce experience often resemble the language of someone standing at the entrance of the bardo, aware that something lies ahead, but not yet aware of how profound that passage might be. A question about recovery after relationships end. Now let us move to another revealing question. Imagine asking someone this: why do people recover from the end of a relationship at different speeds? When people who have experienced divorce answer this question, their responses tend to sound very different. For example, many of them say something like this: recovery depends on how deeply emotions, responsibilities, and daily life were intertwined. This answer reveals an important shift in perspective. People who say this no longer see separation as a purely emotional event. They have learned that even after love fades, the relationship itself may not end immediately. Shared housing, financial obligations, family relationships, social roles, all of these threads continue to exist long after the emotional bond begins to dissolve. And because of that, recovery is not just about healing the heart. It is about untangling an entire system of connections. The depth of emotional wounds. Another common response from those who have experienced divorce is this: recovery depends on how deeply someone was hurt. This answer carries a different kind of weight. It reflects the understanding that some separations are not merely sad, they can profoundly damage one's sense of trust, identity, and self-worth. Experiences of betrayal, rejection, or the collapse of long-held expectations can leave deep psychological imprints. In the teachings of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, powerful emotional imprints are said to leave traces in consciousness. These traces can continue to generate visions, fears, and attachments long after the original event has passed. In a similar way, people who have experienced divorce often recognize that certain emotional wounds remain present in the mind for a long time. The deeper the wound, the longer the recovery. Personality and attachment patterns. Some experienced individuals explain recovery differently. They say, it depends on a person's personality and attachment style. This answer carries an important implication. It suggests that the pace of healing is not only about what happened in the relationship, but also about how a person is wired psychologically. Some people avoid emotional pain and move forward quickly. Others hold tightly to attachment and struggle to let go. Some internalize responsibility for everything that happened. Others externalize blame. Each pattern produces a very different path after a relationship ends. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, individuals encounter different visions during the bardo, depending on their karmic tendencies and attachments. Likewise, after separation, different psychological patterns lead people through entirely different emotional landscapes. When the heart and reality move at different speeds. Another answer frequently given by those who have experienced divorce sounds like this: sometimes the heart moves on faster than reality, and sometimes reality moves on faster than the heart. This observation reflects a very specific kind of experience. There are situations where someone emotionally accepts the end of a relationship, but practical matters, legal processes, financial responsibilities, family connections remain unresolved. And there are other cases where the external world has already moved on, but internally, the person is still struggling to process what happened. This mismatch between emotional closure and practical closure creates a kind of psychological suspension. In the metaphorical language of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it resembles the state in which consciousness has left one world, but has not yet fully entered another. The depth of connection. Finally, some people explain recovery in a very simple but powerful way. The deeper the connection was, the slower the recovery. Notice the key word here: not love, connection. When two lives become deeply intertwined, when identities merge, routines align, and long-term plans intertwine, the relationship becomes more than an emotional bond. It becomes part of a person's life structure. When such a relationship ends, the experience can feel less like losing a partner and more like losing a piece of one's life itself. In the philosophy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, attachment to loved ones is described as one of the strongest forces that can hold consciousness in the transitional state. Similarly, the deeper the connection between two people, the more difficult it becomes to separate quickly. What these answers reveal: if we look carefully, every one of these responses reveals something subtle. A person's answer often reflects the kind of relationship reality they have already lived through. People who have experienced divorce tend to speak about structure, responsibility, interdependence, psychological patterns. People who have not experienced it often speak about feelings, perception, personal differences. Neither perspective is wrong. They simply come from different stages of experience. And just as described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, moving from one stage to another is not merely a change of opinion. It is a transition between worlds of understanding, looking ahead. In the next lecture of this series, we will move even deeper into this theme. The next question will be this: what kind of courage does it take for two people, after spending many years together, to finally choose separate paths? This question is not really about the moment of separation. It is about something deeper: the courage required to rebuild one's life. after the world of a relationship ends. Because sometimes the end of a relationship is not simply a failure. It can also be a passage, a movement from one world of identity into another. And the real question is not only what we lose at that threshold, but also what we are willing to release in order to walk through it. If this lecture helped you reflect more deeply on relationships, marriage, and the psychology of separation, please consider subscribing and sharing the video. In the next episode, Divorce Experience Part 7, we will explore the deeper meaning of courage after relationships end, and why letting go can sometimes be the most difficult step in moving forward.